There is a record buried in the archives of the Petersburg Circuit Court, a single leather-bound ledger that almost no one requests anymore, that contains an impossibility. Page 47, third entry from the top, written in the meticulous copperplate hand common to plantation record-keeping in 1841. Samuel, clerk. Appraised value, $1,400. The word sits there like a crack in glass. Clerk. Enslaved people in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1841 were many things in the eyes of the law and the ledgers that recorded them. They were field hands and house servants, blacksmiths and carpenters, cooks and stable boys, wet nurses and seamstresses. They were listed by function, by value, by the work their bodies could perform. But they were never, not in any legal document, not in any county record, not in any plantation inventory, from the Tidewater to the Piedmont, clerks. Clerks kept books. Clerks handled correspondence. Clerks read and wrote with the facility of educated men. And the law in Virginia, as in every state that had built its economy on the bodies of enslaved people, expressly and absolutely forbade teaching those people to read or write. The penalty for a white person who taught literacy to an enslaved person was up to 6 months' imprisonment and a fine. The penalty for an enslaved person found with written materials was public whipping, sale away from family, or worse. Yet there it is, Samuel, clerk. The man who wrote that entry was Thomas Ashford, owner of Ashford Hall, a tobacco plantation of middling prosperity on 800 acres 12 miles south of Petersburg. He was 41 years old in 1841, a businessman before he was a planter. A man who had inherited land and transformed it through relentless attention to margins and efficiency into something that generated reliable profit in an industry increasingly dependent on uncertain markets and exhausted soil. Ashford was not sentimental. He did not name his horses or wax poetic about the land. He calculated. He optimized. He valued competence wherever he found it. And in the late summer of 1820, he found it in a boy of 11 who corrected a shipping count without being asked. The boy's name was Samuel. He had been born on the property in the spring of 1809, the son of a woman named Patience, who worked in the main house and whose own mother had been brought to Virginia on a ship from Calabar in 1783. Samuel's father was not recorded in any document. Patience never spoke his name where white people could hear it. Samuel grew up in the quarters behind the tobacco barns, in a world measured by bells, the rising bell at first light, the dinner bell at noon, the evening bell at dusk when the work stopped if the season allowed it to stop. He was quick. Everyone saw it. Quick with his hands when he was given a task. Quick to understand patterns. Quick to see how the systems of the plantation worked even when no one explained them to him, because no one explained anything to enslaved children except what was required for them to perform their function. The day Thomas Ashford noticed Samuel was a Tuesday in August, one of those thick, hot Virginia days when the air doesn't move and the tobacco leaves hang limp in the fields. Ashford was at the dock supervising the loading of hogsheads onto a barge that would take them downriver to the Richmond factors. The overseer's foreman was marking them off in a ledger as they went onto the barge. 23, he said, and wrote the number down. Samuel was standing near the dock's edge, ostensibly waiting to be told to do something, actually watching the count because watching was what he did when he had nothing else to occupy his mind. He had counted 25 hogsheads. He should have said nothing. Every instinct trained into him from birth told him to say nothing. White men did not like to be corrected, especially not by black children, especially not in front of other white men. But the number was wrong, and something in Samuel, some part of him that had not yet learned that being right was less important than being invisible, spoke. "Sir," he said quietly, "that's 25. The foreman turned. His face went hard. Ashford raised a hand before the man could speak. "Count them again," Ashford said. The foreman counted again. His lips moved as he pointed at each hogshead. When he finished, he looked at Ashford and said nothing. "Well," Ashford said. 25, sir." Ashford looked at Samuel for a long moment. It was not a kind look. It was the look a jeweler gives a stone whose quality he is just beginning to assess, calculating, estimating value. "Come with me," he said. What happened over the next 5 years was not kindness. It was not mentorship in any sense that word usually implies. It was investment. The deliberate cultivation of a skill set in a piece of property for the purpose of increasing that property's utility and therefore its value. Ashford taught Samuel to read and write the way one trains a hunting dog, through repetition, correction, and the clear understanding that the skill being developed exists to serve the master's purposes entirely. He did it in his office after the day's fieldwork was done, door closed, curtains drawn against the possibility of observation. A white man teaching an enslaved boy to read was illegal. But so were many things Thomas Ashford did when the law interfered with profit. He started with numbers. Samuel learned to recognize numerals, then to write them, then to add and subtract columns. Then came letters. First capitals, then the small forms, then words. Ashford used the plantation ledgers as primers. He would set a page in front of Samuel and make him copy it, line by line, until the letters flowed without hesitation and the spelling matched exactly. By the time Samuel was 16, he was keeping portions of the estate books. By 20, he was managing most of the administrative work that Ashford found tedious. Correspondence with tobacco factors in Richmond, shipping manifests, yield calculations, labor allocation schedules. He worked at a small desk in the corner of Ashford's office, and he was good at what he did. Meticulous, methodical, functionally invisible in the way that Ashford required. The office became Samuel's world. He knew the grain of the desk he worked at, darker along the front edge where hands had rested for years. He knew the smell of the place, tobacco leaf and ink and the faint, acrid bite of the oil lamps in winter. He knew the sound of Ashford's footsteps on the floorboards, could distinguish them from the overseer's heavier tread, knew when Ashford was in a mood to speak and when silence was safer. He knew the ledgers, all of them, and that was where the story really begins. Because Samuel, working in that office day after day, watching the flow of transactions and correspondence that constituted the business of Ashford Hall, began to notice things, small things at first, numbers that didn't quite align. A tobacco shipment recorded in the estate ledger at £10,400, but acknowledged by the Richmond factor's receipt at $10,800. A sale of 2 men to a Georgia trader recorded in the county tax documents at $600 each, but referenced in a private letter at $850. Then, larger things. A separate account book kept in the locked drawer of Ashford's desk that Samuel glimpsed one afternoon when Ashford had been called away suddenly and left the drawer open. That book recorded payments to a woman named Catherine Marbury in Richmond, quarterly payments of $50, regular as clockwork, appearing nowhere in the official estate ledger. Samuel said nothing. He kept working, but he also kept watching. And slowly, over months and then years, he began to understand what he was seeing. Thomas Ashford was stealing, not from the people he enslaved. You cannot steal from people who legally own nothing, who are nothing in the eyes of the law except property themselves. Ashford was stealing from his own family. Ashford Hall had originally belonged to Thomas's older brother Robert, who had died of typhoid in 1835, leaving a widow, Elizabeth, and 3 young children. Robert's will had appointed Thomas as executor of the estate, with instructions to manage the plantation and provide for Elizabeth and the children from its proceeds until the oldest boy came of age. For the first 2 years, Thomas had done so honestly. Then the tobacco market had softened, and Thomas's own finances, he had debts from a failed commercial venture in Petersburg, had grown tight. And Thomas, who was nothing if not resourceful, had begun to adjust the numbers, not dramatically. That would have been noticed, but small amounts, siphoned carefully across multiple transactions. Tobacco shipments recorded at slightly lower weights than actually sold. Enslaved people sold for amounts higher than reported. Expenses inflated. Revenue diminished. All of it documented in the official ledgers with meticulous precision, and all of it false. The real numbers existed only in the locked drawer, in Thomas's private account book, and in the correspondence he kept separate from the estate files, and in Samuel's head. Because Samuel, who had spent 5 years learning to read ledgers, who had the kind of memory for figures that comes from understanding numbers as structures rather than abstractions, was keeping a second set of books. Not on paper. Paper was too dangerous. He kept them in his mind, in an accounting system he had constructed through sheer necessity and extraordinary discipline. He tracked every transaction that passed through Ashford Hall. He noted the discrepancies. He memorized the patterns. He did this for one reason, because knowledge was the only thing he possessed that could not be taken from him by force, and he had learned early that in a world where he owned nothing, not his body, not his labor, not his future, knowledge might someday be the only tool he had. He did not know when he would need it. He only knew that he would. The autumn of 1841 came to Virginia the way it always did, slowly at first, a cooling of the nights in September, then faster as October brought the first frosts and the tobacco leaves yellowed in the fields. The harvest that year was decent, but not exceptional. Prices were soft, credit was tight. By the first week of November, Thomas Ashford was facing a problem he could not calculate his way out of. He owed $8,000 to a Richmond banker named Edward Carmichael, a debt that had come due and that Carmichael, who was not a patient man, wanted paid in full by year's end. Ashford did not have it. His own resources were exhausted. The estate funds, which he had been quietly depleting for years, could not cover a payment of that size without revealing the depth of the discrepancy. What Ashford had was assets: land, equipment, livestock, and 83 human beings whose collective appraised value exceeded $60,000. The most valuable individual asset was Samuel. A literate enslaved man with clerical skills could command a premium price, particularly to buyers in the expanding cotton states who needed plantation managers and record keepers. Ashford had been approached more than once over the years by traders asking if Samuel might be for sale. He had always declined. Samuel was too useful where he was, but usefulness had to be weighed against necessity. On the morning of November 12, 1841, Thomas Ashford sat in his office reviewing the figures one more time, confirming what he already knew. He had no choice. He called Samuel in. Samuel entered the office the way he always did, quietly, without presumption, standing just inside the door waiting to be told what was needed. The morning light came through the window at an angle that left most of the room in shadow. Ashford sat behind his desk, silhouetted. "I'm selling you," Ashford said. No preamble, no explanation. Just the fact, delivered in the same tone he used to discuss tobacco weights. Samuel stood very still. His face showed nothing. It was a face he had learned to make over 32 years, a mask that revealed neither understanding nor emotion, that gave white people who looked at him nothing to react to. "A buyer's been located," Ashford continued. "Cotton planter in Mississippi. Needs a man who can manage records. The sale will conclude next week. The price is $1,400. Samuel said nothing. Ashford looked at him, and for just a moment something that might have been discomfort crossed his face. Then it was gone. "You've been useful here," he said. "I expect you'll be useful there." "Yes, sir," Samuel said. The words came automatically, a reflex. "You're dismissed." Samuel walked out of the office, through the hall, out the back door of the main house. He walked across the yard toward the quarters, past the kitchen building where smoke rose from the chimney, past the well where 2 women were drawing water, past the carpentry shop where the sound of sawing came through the open door. He walked until he reached the small cabin he shared with his mother, and he went inside and sat down on the edge of the rope bed and put his hands on his knees and stared at the opposite wall. He sat there until his mother came in at dusk, and then he told her. Patience was 52 years old. She had survived the sale of 2 children decades before. A daughter sold to a North Carolina trader when she was 8. A son sold to pay a debt when he was 12. Samuel was the only child she had left on the same piece of ground she stood on. She sat down beside him. She did not cry. She had learned, as all enslaved mothers learned, that tears were a luxury that accomplished nothing and cost too much. She said, "How long do we have?" 6 days. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet, Samuel could hear everything she was not saying, all the things that might have been said if they lived in a different world, where mothers did not have to watch their children sold like cattle, where 6 days was not all the time you got to prepare for a permanent goodbye. Then she said, "Then we use them." Samuel looked at her. "Use them how?" Patience turned to face him. Her eyes, in the dim light of the cabin, were sharp. "You've been keeping those books in your head for years. I know you have. You think I don't see you at night, lying there with your eyes open, going over the numbers. You think I don't know what you've been watching." Samuel said nothing. "You have something on him," Patience said. "Something that matters. And you have 6 days to decide what to do with it." What Samuel did in those 6 days required a clarity of purpose that most people discover in themselves only when there is no other choice. He had access to Ashford's office. That access would end the moment he was taken to Richmond for the sale. He had knowledge of what was in that locked drawer, what was in the private account book, what was in the correspondence files. Knowledge was not enough. Knowledge that existed only in his head could be dismissed, denied, attributed to malice or invention. He needed proof. On the first night after the main house was dark and the only light in the office was the single candle he had brought with him, Samuel opened the locked drawer. He had watched Ashford unlock it hundreds of times. He knew where the key was kept, in a small wooden box on the shelf behind the desk, underneath a stack of old survey maps that no one ever touched. The drawer opened silently. Inside was the private ledger, a sheaf of correspondence, and a small leather folder containing receipts. Samuel took the ledger to his desk. He opened it to the first page, and he began to copy. Not everything. There wasn't time, and carrying too much would be impossible to conceal. He copied the specific entries that demonstrated the pattern most clearly: the discrepancies between reported and actual tobacco sales, the payments to Catherine Marbury, the records of enslaved people sold for amounts different from what the estate had been credited. He wrote on paper taken from the bottom of the supply drawer, one sheet at a time, where the absence would not be immediately noticed. He wrote in his own hand, not Ashford's copperplate, but his own careful, deliberate script that he had developed over years of practice. He worked by candlelight. The office at night was utterly silent except for the scratch of the pen and the occasional settling sound of the house. Outside, November wind moved through the bare trees. Inside, Samuel copied numbers and dates and names with the focused attention of a man who understands that what he is doing is both extraordinarily dangerous and absolutely necessary. He worked for 3 hours that first night. When he finished, he had 4 pages. He returned the ledger to the drawer, locked it, replaced the key, cleaned the pen, put away the paper, and walked back to the quarters in the dark. He did this for 5 nights. On the 5th night, his mother brought him something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a leather document folder, the kind used by lawyers and clerks for carrying papers. It was old, the leather cracked at the corners, but intact. She set it on the table without saying where it had come from or how she had gotten it. Some things didn't need to be explained. Samuel placed the copied pages inside. 23 pages in total, folded carefully, organized by category. Tobacco transactions, estate discrepancies, the Marbury payments, receipts showing dual pricing on sales. On the morning of the 6th day, he sewed the folder into the lining of his coat. The only coat he owned, the one he would wear when they took him to Richmond. That evening, Patience held his face in her hands and looked at him for a long time. She did not say goodbye. There was no point in saying a word that meant nothing, that changed nothing. She said, "You make them see what he is." Samuel said, "I will." It was the last conversation they ever had. The transaction was scheduled for November 19th in Richmond, at the offices of a slave trader named Harris Webb, whose establishment on Broad Street handled the administrative mechanics of human commerce with the bureaucratic efficiency of a shipping company. Thomas Ashford and Samuel left Ashford Hall at dawn, traveling by horse, Ashford riding, Samuel walking beside the horse for the first 5 miles until Ashford, impatient with the pace, told him to ride behind. They stopped once to water the horse. They did not speak. Richmond appeared through the bare November trees like something from a different world. Brick buildings, cobbled streets, the smell of coal smoke and the river. They arrived at Webb's office at mid-morning. The office was a large room on the 2nd floor, plainly furnished. A desk, chairs, a shelf of ledgers, a contract table. Harris Webb was a man of about 50, thin and precise in his movements, dressed in a dark suit that had been expensive 5 years ago. He greeted Ashford with professional warmth and gestured to the chairs. The buyer was already there. His name was Josiah Renfrow. He was perhaps 45, a cotton planter from Mississippi, in Richmond, to purchase equipment and labor for a new property he had acquired on the Yazoo River. He had the look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, sun-darkened skin, calloused hands, but who could wear a suit when business required it. He stood when Ashford entered. They shook hands. Renfrow glanced at Samuel with the appraising look men of his class gave to horses and enslaved people, assessing value with the same practical detachment. "This is the one," Renfrow said. "This is Samuel," Ashford said. "As I described in my letter, literate, experienced with accounts and correspondence. He's kept my books for more than a decade." Renfrow nodded. He turned to Samuel. "You can read a ledger?" "Yes, sir," Samuel said. "Write a business letter?" "Yes, sir." "Calculate compound interest?" "Yes, sir." Renfrow looked back at Ashford. "And you're certain of the price?" $1,400 is fair for a man of his skills," Ashford said. "You won't find his equal in Mississippi." Webb had the bill of sale already prepared, written out in his clerk's neat hand on heavy paper with spaces left for signatures. He set it on the table. The document described Samuel in the specific dehumanizing language of such instruments. One Negro man named Samuel, approximately 32 years of age, sound in body and mind, literate, experienced in clerical work, sold this 19th day of November, 1841 by Thomas Ashford of Dinwiddie County, Virginia, to Josiah Renfrow of Warren County, Mississippi, for the sum of $1,400 paid in full. Ashford signed. Webb witnessed. Renfrow reached for the pen, and Samuel spoke. "Mr. Renfrow." Everyone in the room turned to look at him. Samuel's heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to be silent, to be invisible, to let this happen because speaking would only make it worse. But he had not carried those documents sewn into his coat for 6 days to remain silent now. "Before you sign," Samuel said, his voice steady in a way that surprised him, "there's something you should know about Mr. Ashford's business practices." The room went absolutely still. Ashford's face drained of color. "Samuel, be quiet." Samuel reached inside his coat. His fingers found the edge of the folder. He drew it out. "These are copies," he said, looking at Renfrow, "of documents from Ashford Hall. They show that Mr. Ashford has been systematically defrauding his late brother's estate for at least 6 years. If you're purchasing me with the expectation that I represent legitimate property from a solvent estate, you should know the estate is being stolen from, and the theft is documented." He placed the folder on the table in front of Harris Webb. Ashford stood. "That is a lie. He has no—" "Read them," Samuel said to Renfrow. "The numbers are all there." Renfrow, who had not moved, looked at Samuel for a long moment. Then he picked up the folder. He opened it. He read the first page, his eyes moving across Samuel's careful handwriting. Then he read the second page. Then the third. The silence in the room had a texture to it now, thick and pressured. Renfrow set the pages down. He looked at Ashford. "Is any of this true?" Ashford's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Renfrow said, "I asked you a question." Ashford said, "Those documents are—" "He had no right to—" "I didn't ask about his rights," Renfrow said, his voice going cold. I asked if it's true. Ashford looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Samuel. Something ugly moved behind his eyes. He said nothing. Renfrow closed the folder. He stood. He said to Webb, "I'm not signing anything until I've had my attorney review these materials. If what's in here is accurate, I'm not touching this sale. I won't be drawn into litigation when the estate fraud comes to light." He picked up the folder. He looked at Ashford one more time. "You lied to me about what you were selling. We're done." He walked out. Harris Webb sat very still for a moment after Renfrow left. Then he looked at Samuel with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite anger, not quite admiration. Something else. "You know what you just did?" he said. "Yes, sir," Samuel said. Webb turned to Ashford. "You need to leave my office." Ashford's hands were shaking. "He's still my property. You can take him and go," Webb said. "I don't know what happens next with this, but it doesn't happen here. Get out." What happened next unfolded over the course of 11 days and became, briefly, one of Richmond's more scandalous commercial disputes. Not because anyone cared about the moral dimensions of Thomas Ashford's theft, but because it had been exposed by an enslaved man in a manner so audacious that it could not be quietly dismissed. Josiah Renfrow went directly to his attorney, a Richmond lawyer named Philip Garnett. Garnett read through Samuel's copies that same afternoon. By evening, he had sent a letter to Thomas Ashford informing him that his client was withdrawing from the purchase and demanding return of the $200 deposit Renfrow had paid. But Garnett did something else too. He made copies of Samuel's documents, and he sent them, along with a carefully worded letter, to a Petersburg attorney named Peter Cormack, who specialized in estate law. The letter suggested that Cormack might find the enclosed materials of interest to a potential client, Mrs. Elizabeth Ashford, widow of Robert Ashford, whose estate was currently being administered by Robert's brother Thomas. Cormack read the documents. Then he rode to Petersburg and knocked on Elizabeth Ashford's door. Elizabeth Ashford was 41 years old. She had been living for 6 years on the allowance Thomas provided from the estate, an allowance that was significantly smaller than she had expected given what her husband had left. She had 3 children to raise. She had a house that needed constant repair. She had a son who would inherit the plantation when he came of age, if there was anything left to inherit. She had suspected, quietly and without any means to investigate, that Thomas was not managing the estate honestly. But suspicion without proof was useless. Peter Cormack gave her proof. She sat in her parlor and read through Samuel's careful documentation. The tobacco discrepancies, the falsified sale prices, the payments to a Richmond woman whose connection to Thomas was unstated but clear. When she finished, she looked at Cormack and said, "Can we use this?" "Yes," Cormack said. "We can." The lawsuit was filed on December 2, 1841, in Petersburg Circuit Court. Elizabeth Ashford, individually and as administratrix of the estate of Robert Ashford, deceased, versus Thomas Ashford. The complaint alleged breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent accounting, and misappropriation of estate funds totaling no less than $6,000. Attached as exhibits were Samuel's copied documents, affidavits from 2 Richmond tobacco factors confirming discrepancies in reported shipment weights, and a deposition from Harris Webb describing what had occurred in his office on November 19th. Thomas Ashford, when served with the complaint, sat in his office at Ashford Hall and stared at the papers for a long time. Then he sent for his attorney. The attorney, a man named Cyrus Lattimore, read the complaint and the supporting documentation. Then he looked at Ashford and said, "You can't win this." "He's an enslaved man," Ashford said. "His testimony isn't admissible in—" "It's not testimony," Lattimore interrupted. "It's documentation. He didn't testify against you. He produced records. Records that third parties have now corroborated. The tobacco factors confirmed the discrepancies. Webb confirmed the disclosure. Your sister-in-law has standing to sue you as executor. The court doesn't need Samuel's testimony. The documents speak for themselves." Ashford was quiet for a long moment. "What do I do?" "You settle," Lattimore said. You settle before this gets to trial and before Elizabeth's attorney starts digging deeper and finds things that might be criminal rather than just civil. What will it cost me? Most of what you took, Lattimore said, and your position as executor. And possibly your reputation, depending on how much of this gets into the newspapers. The settlement was negotiated over 5 weeks. It was signed on January 14th, 1842. Thomas Ashford agreed to transfer 200 acres of Ashford Hall's best tobacco land to the estate, to repay $4,200 in documented misappropriated funds, and to relinquish his position as executor in favor of a court-appointed administrator. In exchange, Elizabeth Ashford agreed not to pursue criminal prosecution for fraud. The settlement made no mention of Samuel, because Samuel, throughout this entire proceeding, had existed in a legal gray space. Not sold, because the sale had been voided, not returned to Ashford Hall, because his status was unclear while the estate litigation was ongoing, and not free, because nothing in Virginia law provided any mechanism for that outcome. He was held, for 7 weeks, in the Richmond City Jail. Not in the cells used for criminals. In a small room on the 2nd floor, a space normally used for storing records, where he was given a cot and a blanket and 3 meals a day, and was left alone except when attorneys needed him. He was deposed twice. Once by Elizabeth Ashford's attorney, once by Thomas Ashford's. Both depositions covered the same ground: how he had gained access to the documents, how he had made the copies, whether he could confirm the accuracy of the figures. He answered every question plainly and precisely. He did not elaborate. He did not express emotion. He simply answered what was asked. Peter Cormack, Elizabeth Ashford's attorney, asked him one question that went beyond the strict legal requirements. "Why did you do this? You had to know what the risk was." Samuel looked at him. The room was cold. Through the window he could see bare trees and a gray winter sky. He said, "I was being sold away from my mother, away from the only place I'd ever known. I was losing everything. The only thing I had that was mine, that couldn't be taken by force, was what I knew. I decided what to do with it." Cormack wrote the answer down, though it appeared nowhere in the official deposition transcript. When the settlement was finalized, Samuel's status was resolved as part of the asset distribution. He was reclassified as estate property and placed under the control of the court-appointed administrator, who had no personal attachment to him and no reason to keep him. Samuel was sold 8 weeks later. The buyer was a Richmond merchant named William Faber, who owned a dry goods business on Carey Street and needed a clerk to manage his inventory and shipping records. Faber had heard about Samuel through his attorney, had heard about an enslaved man whose literacy and accounting skills had been demonstrated in circuit court proceedings. He paid $1,100. Samuel went to work in Faber's warehouse. He kept ledgers. He managed correspondence with suppliers. He worked 6 days a week in a room that smelled of flour and coffee and salted fish, and he was never allowed to forget what he was, but he was also never again asked to be less capable than he actually was. He worked for William Faber for 9 years, and then, in the spring of 1851, something happened that Samuel had not expected and had no framework for understanding until it was offered to him. William Faber, whose health had been declining for 2 years, called Samuel into his office and made him a proposal. The morning William Faber called Samuel into his private office, Richmond was locked in one of those cold April rains that turn the streets to mud and make the James River the color of old iron. Samuel had been working since dawn, updating the shipping manifests for a textile order bound for a merchant in Norfolk. His hands smelled of ink and his shoulders ached from hunching over the ledger. "Samuel," Faber said from the doorway. "Come in here, close the door." Samuel set down his pen. He followed Faber into the smaller office at the back of the warehouse, the one with the window overlooking the alley, the one where Faber kept his private accounts and the lockbox with the week's receipts. Faber sat down behind his desk. He did not look well. He had lost weight over the winter, and there was a grayness to his skin that no amount of rest seemed to improve. He was 53 years old and looked 70. "Sit," Faber said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Samuel sat. In 9 years of working for Faber, he had never been invited to sit in this office. Faber folded his hands on the desk. For a moment he seemed to be arranging words in his head, testing how they would sound before he committed to them. Then he said, "I'm dying." Samuel said nothing. It was not a surprise. Anyone who had seen Faber in recent months could read the signs. "The physician gives me 6 months," Faber continued. "Maybe less. I'm selling the business. I have a buyer, a man from Petersburg who'll keep the operation running, and he's agreed to retain most of the current staff." He paused. "That would include you, or—" He stopped. The rain drummed against the window. "Or," Samuel said quietly. Faber leaned forward. "Or I can sell you separately to someone else, under terms I specify, and the person I sell you to can be someone who would be willing to manumit you." The word hung in the air between them. Manumit, to free. Samuel felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, not yet, because hope was dangerous and he had learned not to let it take root too quickly. But something. An opening where there had been only wall. "Manumission is difficult in Virginia," Samuel said carefully. It was an understatement. Virginia law had made voluntary manumission nearly impossible over the past 2 decades, requiring freed people to leave the state within 12 months or be re-enslaved. And even obtaining permission to free someone required navigating a legal process designed to discourage it. "It is," Faber agreed. "But it's easier in Pennsylvania. I know a man in Philadelphia, a Quaker merchant named Josiah Morris. I've done business with him for 15 years. He's a good man, Samuel. An honest man. If I sold you to him for a nominal sum, $1 say, he could take you to Pennsylvania and file for your manumission there. Pennsylvania law allows it. You'd be free." Samuel sat very still. He was aware of his own heartbeat, of the sound of the rain, of the weight of the air in the small room. "Why?" he said. Faber looked at him. "Because you've kept my books for 9 years without a single error I didn't make first. Because you've made this business run better than it has any right to run. And because what you did to Thomas Ashford in 1841, he shook his head. "That was the most extraordinary act of self-preservation I've ever heard of. A man who could do that deserves a chance to see what else he's capable of." Samuel's throat was tight. He did not trust his voice. Faber said, "I can't undo what's been done to you. I can't give you back the years, but I can do this, if you want it." "If I want it," Samuel repeated. The words sounded strange in his mouth, foreign. "If I want it." As though wanting had ever mattered. As though his desires had ever shaped anything. But Faber was waiting for an answer. "Yes," Samuel said. "I want it." The arrangements took 2 months. Faber sold his business to the Petersburg merchant in early May, for a price that would allow him to live out his remaining time in modest comfort. Separately, quietly, with the assistance of an attorney who asked no unnecessary questions, he arranged the sale of Samuel to Josiah Morris of Philadelphia for the sum of $1. The bill of sale was dated June 28, 1851. It was signed in the same office where Samuel had worked for 9 years, witnessed by Faber's clerk, and recorded with the Richmond city clerk the following day. Josiah Morris arrived in Richmond on July 2nd. He was a man of about 50, plainly dressed, with the direct manner of someone who has spent his life among people who say what they mean. He shook Samuel's hand when they met. Actually shook his hand, as though Samuel were a man entering a business arrangement rather than property being transferred, and said, "Mr. Faber speaks very highly of you. I'm glad to make your acquaintance." They left Richmond on July 5th, traveling by train to Petersburg, then by stage to the Potomac, then by another train to Philadelphia. Samuel carried everything he owned in a single canvas bag, 2 changes of clothes, a book Faber had given him as a parting gift, the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which Samuel had not yet opened but held like a talisman, and the small carved wooden box his mother had made for him when he was a child. He had not seen his mother in 10 years. He did not know if she was still alive. There had been no way to send word, no way to receive it. The not knowing was a constant ache, worse than any certain grief. Philadelphia appeared through the train window on a hot July afternoon. Brick row houses, church steeples, the wide green commons, streets crowded with carriages and carts and people of every description. Black people walking freely. Black people in good clothes. Black people who did not step off the sidewalk when white people approached. Samuel stared. Morris noticed. He said gently, "It's different here." "Yes," Samuel said. His voice came out hoarse. They went to Morris's office, a modest suite of rooms above a dry goods store on Market Street. Morris produced the manumission papers, already prepared, needing only Samuel's signature and the court's approval. "Pennsylvania law is clear on this," Morris said. "Any enslaved person brought into the state can petition for freedom. The court will grant it as a matter of course. There'll be a hearing, just a formality. You'll need to appear and confirm that you're seeking manumission voluntarily. Then it's done." "And after?" Samuel asked. "After you're free, legally permanently free. You can work where you like, live where you like. You'll need to register with the city as a free person of color. There are laws about that and there are restrictions, I won't lie to you. But you'll be free, Samuel. That word will mean something here that it never could in Virginia." The hearing was held on August 3, 1851, in the Philadelphia County Court. Samuel stood before a judge whose name he did not catch, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and leather. The judge asked him 3 questions. Did he understand what manumission meant? Was he seeking it of his own free will? Did he have any objection to the petition? Samuel answered yes, yes, and no. The judge signed the order. The clerk recorded it. And just like that, after 42 years of bondage, after being born into a system designed to hold him until he died, Samuel was free. He walked out of the courthouse into the August heat and stood on the steps, blinking in the sunlight, feeling untethered, as though gravity had released him and he might simply float away. Morris walked him to a boarding house on Lombard Street, run by a free black woman named Mrs. Chesney, who had been taking in newly freed people for 20 years. She showed Samuel to a small room on the 3rd floor, a bed, a chair, a washstand, a window overlooking the street. "It's yours as long as you need it," she said. "Rent's $2 a week, payable when you have it. No one here will ask where you came from or what you ran from. You're safe." Samuel set his bag on the bed. He looked at the room, his room, a space that was his because the law said it was, not because someone permitted him to occupy it. He sat down on the bed and he cried. Not quietly, not the silent, swallowed crying he had learned as a child. He cried the way a man cries when something inside him breaks open after being held closed for so long that he had forgotten it could open. Mrs. Chesney stood in the doorway for a moment, then quietly closed the door and left him alone. Samuel found work within a week. A shipping firm on the Delaware waterfront needed a clerk. The owner, a man named Thaddeus Kern, looked at Samuel's references from William Faber, asked him a few questions about ledger keeping and manifest systems, and hired him at a wage of $8 a week. $8 a week. Money that was his. Money he could spend or save or send to. He stopped himself. There was no one to send it to. His mother might be dead. Even if she was alive, there was no safe way to get money to an enslaved woman in Virginia. No way that wouldn't raise questions and put her in danger. But he saved it anyway. Every week, he took his wages and put $6 in a small tin box he kept under his bed. He lived on the remaining $2, cheaply, carefully, with the ingrained frugality of someone who had never had the luxury of waste. By the end of 1851, he had saved $120. He did not know what he was saving for. Only that having money, having something that was purely his, that represented his labor and his choice, mattered in a way he could not articulate. He met Clara in the spring of 1852. She worked as a seamstress in a shop on South Street, a freeborn woman 2 years younger than Samuel, whose parents had come to Philadelphia from New York in the 1820s. She was small and precise in her movements, with hands that moved over fabric the way Samuel's moved over ledgers, with absolute certainty. They met at Mother Bethel AME Church, where Samuel had started attending services, not because he had any particular faith. His relationship with God was complicated by 42 years of watching God permit things that should not be permitted, but because the church was the center of the city's black community, and Samuel needed community the way a plant needs light. Clara sat 2 rows ahead of him. He noticed her because she sang, really sang, with a voice that was clear and strong and entirely unself-conscious. After the service, she turned and saw him staring and raised one eyebrow in a way that was both amused and challenging. "You planning to introduce yourself?" she said. "Or just keep looking?" Samuel felt his face go hot. My name is Samuel. Samuel Bridges." "Clara Freeman," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. Her hand was warm and calloused from needlework. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've been here since July." "Where from?" "Virginia." Her expression changed slightly. A flicker of understanding, of recognition. She did not ask how he had gotten out. She did not need to. "Well, Mr. Bridges," she said, "welcome to Philadelphia." They were married in November of 1853, in a small ceremony at Mother Bethel with Josiah Morris as a witness. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, pale blue with ivory buttons. Samuel wore the first suit he had ever owned, purchased with money he had saved over 2 years. The preacher said the words that made them husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law. The law. That still felt impossible. That his marriage was legal, recognized, protected. That no one could sell Clara away from him. That their children, if they had children, would be born free. They had 2 children. A daughter, Louisa, born in 1854. A son, David, born in 1857. Samuel held each of them for the first time with a kind of terror and wonder that made his hands shake. These were his children. His, not someone else's property. Not subject to sale or separation. His. He taught them to read before they started school. He would sit with them in the evenings in the small house he and Clara rented on Rodman Street, and he would open a book and point to the letters, the way Thomas Ashford had once done with him, but for an entirely different reason. Ashford had taught him to read to make him useful. Samuel taught his children to read to make them free. Free in a way that went beyond legal status. Free in the sense of having access to knowledge, to ideas, to the possibility of choosing what they would become. The years passed. Samuel worked for Thaddeus Kern for 16 years. When Kern retired in 1867, Samuel was promoted to senior clerk and given oversight of the firm's entire accounting operation. He was good at it, better than good. The business grew, and Samuel's salary grew with it. He bought the house on Rodman Street in 1869. It was the first property he had ever owned. A narrow 2-story row house with a small yard in back where Clara grew tomatoes and herbs. The deed was in his name, Samuel Bridges, Freeman. He hung the deed on the wall of his study, framed. Clara saw it and smiled. "You planning to just look at it, or you going to finish unpacking?" "I'm looking at it," Samuel said. "I can see that. I own a house, Clara." "I know. A house. With my name on the deed." She came and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. "I know," she said again, softer. They stood there for a while, looking at the framed paper on the wall. In the summer of 1872, Samuel received a letter. It came to his office, forwarded through a series of addresses, the envelope worn and resealed multiple times. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. The postmark was from Petersburg, Virginia. Samuel opened it at his desk, alone in the office after hours. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in a careful, educated hand. "Dear Mr. Bridges, my name is Peter Cormack, Jr. You may remember my father, who represented Mrs. Elizabeth Ashford in the estate case of 1841 to 42. My father passed away last year, and in settling his papers I came across the file from that case, including the depositions and the documents you provided. I am writing to inform you of something I thought you might wish to know. Your mother, Patience, passed away in April of this year. She was still at Ashford Hall, which is now owned by Thomas Ashford's son, as Thomas himself died in 1866. I learned of her death through a client who has business with the current owner. I am told by those who knew her that she spoke of you often, and that she kept your name with her until the end. I thought you would want to know that she did not forget you, as I suspect you have not forgotten her. I hope this letter finds you well. Respectfully, Peter Cormack, Jr., Attorney at Law. Samuel read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and sat at his desk in the empty office as the light faded outside and the sounds of the waterfront dimmed to evening quiet. His mother was dead. He had known, logically, that she was probably dead. She would have been 73. Enslaved people rarely lived that long. But knowing logically and knowing were different things. She had spoken of him often. She had kept his name. He put his head in his hands and sat there for a long time. In 1879, when his daughter Louisa was 25 and teaching at a school for black children in South Philadelphia, she asked him to write down what had happened in Virginia. "Not for me," she said, "for your grandchildren. So they know where they came from. So they know what you did." Samuel was 70 years old. His hands were not as steady as they had been, and his eyes tired easily. But he sat down at the desk in his study, the one beneath the framed deed, and he began to write. He wrote for 2 months, working in the evenings after Clara had gone to bed, filling page after page in his careful, deliberate hand. He wrote about Ashford Hall, about learning to read in secret, about the locked drawer and the private ledger, about the 6 days before the sale, the copied documents, the scene in Harris Webb's office. He wrote about his mother. He wrote about the 9 years with William Faber, about Josiah Morris, about the moment in the Philadelphia courthouse when the judge signed the manumission order. He wrote about Clara, about Louisa and David, about the house on Rodman Street. And at the end, he wrote, "I have been asked why I took the risk in 1841, why I chose to expose Thomas Ashford when I knew the consequences could have been severe. The answer is this: I had knowledge, and knowledge was the only thing I possessed that could not be taken from me by force. Not my body, that could be sold. Not my labor, that could be compelled. Not my family, they could be taken. But what I knew, what I had learned, what I understood, that was mine. I chose to use it. Not because I believed it would set me free. I had no such certainty. But because the alternative was to let it die with me, unused, and I could not bear that. I built something with that knowledge. Something small, perhaps, in the grand scheme of history. But it was mine. I decided what to do with it. In a world where I was permitted to decide almost nothing, that mattered. If you are reading this, you are my blood. You are free. You were born free, and you will die free, and your children will be born free. Remember that this was not always so. Remember what it cost. Remember that knowledge is power, and that power, once gained, cannot be taken back. Use it well. The account ran to 43 pages. Samuel read it through once when he finished, making small corrections in the margins. Then he gave it to Louisa. "Keep this safe," he said. "I will," she promised. Samuel Bridges died on March 14, 1884, at the age of 75. The cause of death was listed in the city records as pneumonia. He died at home, in the house he owned, with Clara holding his hand. His obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune was brief. Bridges, Samuel, age 75, of Rodman Street, born in Virginia. Resident of Philadelphia since 1851. Longtime employee of Kern and Associates shipping firm. Member of Mother Bethel AME Church. Survived by his wife Clara, daughter Louisa, son David, and 4 grandchildren. Services Friday at Mother Bethel. It did not mention Thomas Ashford. It did not mention the documents or the lawsuit or the thing he had done in a Richmond office 43 years earlier that had changed the course of his life. But the people who attended his funeral knew. Louisa had told them. Not as gossip, but as testimony, as evidence of what was possible, as proof that enslaved people had not been passive victims, but active agents of their own liberation in whatever ways were available to them. She kept her father's account carefully, wrapped in oilcloth, stored in a wooden box in her own home. When she died in 1920, she passed it to her son Thomas with the same instruction her father had given her. Keep this safe. Thomas kept it. His daughter Ruth kept it. And in 1956, Ruth's son, James Bridges, a schoolteacher in Philadelphia, donated it to the Library Company of Philadelphia as part of a collection of family papers. It sat there, mostly unread, for 33 years, until a graduate student named Nicole Harmon requested the wrong box and found something she wasn't looking for. Nicole Harmon was 26 years old in the autumn of 1989, midway through her doctoral program at Temple University, and about 6 months into a dissertation that was slowly eating her alive. The dissertation was titled Economic Literacy and Agency Among Enslaved People in the Antebellum Upper South, and it was, in theory, an analysis of the evidence, fragmentary, scattered, mostly circumstantial, that enslaved people in Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware had engaged with numerical and commercial literacy in ways that complicated the standard narrative of absolute ignorance and dependence. In practice, it was an exercise in trying to build an argument from scraps, a reference here to an enslaved man who kept mental tallies of tobacco weights, a court case there involving an enslaved woman who had challenged the accounting of her hire-out wages. Nothing direct, nothing in their own words, because enslaved people, for the most part, did not leave written records. They were forbidden from learning to write, and even when they learned anyway, in secret at great risk, what they wrote was rarely preserved. Nicole had been working in archives for 8 months, traveling between Richmond, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, looking for anything that might give her more than scraps. She was beginning to think her entire project was doomed. And then she requested the wrong box. She had been at the Library Company of Philadelphia for 3 days, working through a collection of merchant papers from the 1840s. On her list was a collection labeled Morris Family Papers, 1820 to 1870, correspondence and business records from a Quaker merchant family involved in the anti-slavery movement. She filled out the call slip, handed it to the archivist, and waited. The archivist came back 20 minutes later with a box. Nicole opened it without looking at the label, her mistake, and started going through the folders. The first folder contained what looked like family letters. The second contained account books. The third contained... She stopped. The third folder contained a handwritten manuscript, 43 pages, titled in a careful, slightly irregular hand, An Account of My Life in Bondage and Freedom, written by Samuel Bridges, Philadelphia, 1879. Nicole's hands went still. She opened the folder carefully. The pages were old, the paper browned at the edges, but the ink was still legible. She began to read. By the 3rd page, she had forgotten where she was. By the 10th page, she was holding her breath. By the time she reached the account of the scene in Harris Webb's office, I reached inside my coat. My fingers found the edge of the folder. I drew it out. She had her hand over her mouth. She read all 43 pages without stopping. When she finished, she sat at the reading room table, staring at the final page, her heart pounding. She looked up at the archivist. Do you have anything else from this family? Anything related to Samuel Bridges? The archivist checked the catalog. There's a note in the finding aid that the Bridges family donated additional materials in the 1950s. Let me see what we have. She came back with 2 more folders. One contained letters between Samuel and his daughter Louisa. The other contained a copy of the bill of sale from 1851, the $1 sale to Josiah Morris, and, clipped to it, the manumission order from Philadelphia County Court, dated August 3, 1851. Nicole stared at the manumission order. She touched the edge of the paper with one finger, very gently. Then she opened her notebook and started writing. The first thing she did, after leaving the library company, was verify the lawsuit. If Samuel's account was true, if the lawsuit had actually happened, there would be a record. Court cases didn't just disappear. She took the train to Petersburg 3 weeks later and went to the circuit court clerk's office. The clerk, a woman in her 60s who looked like she had been working there since the building was built, listened to Nicole's request with the patient skepticism of someone who deals with researchers regularly. "You're looking for a case from 1841? "Yes, ma'am. Ashford versus Ashford. Filed December 2nd, 1841. The clerk sighed. "That's going to be in the old records. Downstairs. You know how to handle archival documents?" "Yes, ma'am." "Don't touch them with wet hands. Don't lean on them. Don't." "I know," Nicole said. "I promise." The basement of the Petersburg courthouse was exactly what Nicole had expected. Dim, dusty, smelling of old paper and mildew. The case files from the 1840s were stored in wooden cabinets along the far wall, organized by year. She found the drawer labeled 1841 to 1842. She opened it. She flipped through the files, her fingers moving carefully over the brittle folder tabs. And there it was. Ashford versus Ashford. Filed December 2nd, 1841. Nicole pulled the file. She carried it to the small table under the single overhead light. She opened it. The complaint was on top, written in the formal legal language of the 1840s. Elizabeth Ashford, individually and as administratrix of the estate of Robert Ashford, deceased, complains against Thomas Ashford. The supporting documents were attached: affidavits from tobacco factors, a deposition from Harris Webb, and, clipped to the complaint as Exhibit C, 23 pages in Samuel Bridges's handwriting. The same handwriting she had seen in his memoir. Nicole sat very still. She looked at the documents for a long time. Then she took out her camera and started photographing everything. Her dissertation became something different after that. It was no longer an argument built from scraps. It was a case study, a deep examination of one man's use of literacy and documentation as a tool of resistance. She spent the next year reconstructing Samuel's life in as much detail as the archives would allow. She found the Ashford Hall plantation records at the Virginia Historical Society, including the ledger with Samuel's name listed as clerk, the only enslaved person in the entire county records with that designation. She found William Faber's business papers at the Richmond Historical Society, including references to Samuel in Faber's correspondence with Josiah Morris. She found the Philadelphia City Directory listings showing Samuel's residence and occupation from 1851 to 1884. She found Clara's death certificate, 1891, age 63, pneumonia. She found Louisa's teaching records at the Philadelphia Board of Education archives. She found David's military service record. He had enlisted in the U.S. Colored Troops in 1863 and served until the end of the war. She built a picture of Samuel's life that was more complete than most enslaved people ever get. Not because his life was more important than theirs, but because he had written it down, and because his family had kept it, and because the archive had, by accident and intention, preserved it. Her dissertation was titled The Ledger and the Law: Samuel Bridges and the Use of Documentary Evidence as Resistance in Antebellum Virginia. She defended it in May 1993. Her committee passed her unanimously. One of the committee members, an older historian who had been studying slavery for 40 years, shook her hand afterward and said, "This is the most important thing you'll ever write. Publish it." She did. The Ledger and the Law was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1994. It was 312 pages, including a complete transcription of Samuel's memoir and photographic reproductions of the key documents from the 1841 lawsuit. It was reviewed in the Journal of African American History, the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, and the Journal of Southern History. The reviews were positive. The book sold modestly, About 2,000 copies in its first year, mostly to university libraries and scholars. It did not make Nicole famous. It did not become a bestseller. But it did something else. It put Samuel's name in the historical record. Not as a footnote, not as an enslaved man in Virginia, but as a named individual with agency, intelligence, and a documented impact on the world around him. The book was assigned in graduate seminars on slavery and resistance. It was cited in other scholars' work. Samuel's story was included in textbooks, in museum exhibits, in the expanding conversation about how enslaved people resisted and survived. In 1996, the Virginia Historical Society mounted an exhibition titled Documenting Bondage, Commercial Records and Slavery in the Antebellum South. Samuel's copied ledger pages were displayed alongside the official Ashford Hall records, which had been donated decades earlier by a descendant who had no idea what they represented. Visitors could see both sets of books side by side, the official record and the counter-record, the lie and the truth. A photograph of that exhibit appeared in the Richmond Times-Dispatch with a caption that read, "Enslaved clerk's documentation exposed plantation fraud in 1841. In 2003, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a historian at the University of Virginia, published an article in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography titled Information Networks Among Enslaved People in the Upper South, The Samuel Bridges Case as Evidence of Systematic Knowledge Circulation. The article used Samuel's case to argue that literacy among enslaved people, while rare, was less rare than previously believed, and that literate enslaved people often served as nodes in informal information networks that operated beneath the notice of enslavers. Whitfield had found references to Samuel in other sources. A letter between two Petersburg planters in 1842, warning each other about the dangers of permitting excessive education in valuable property. A diary entry by a Richmond merchant mentioning a recent scandal involving a Negro clerk who turned on his master. A cautionary tale for those who forget the natural order. Samuel had become, briefly, a ghost in the correspondence of the planter class. A reminder that the system they had built contained vulnerabilities they had not fully anticipated. In the spring of 2017, a high school history teacher in Petersburg named Angela Moss was looking for primary sources for her 11th grade U.S. history class. She taught at a public school where most of the students were black and brown, where most came from working-class families, and where the standard textbook treatment of slavery, passive victims, noble abolitionists, inevitable emancipation, left her students disengaged and skeptical. She wanted something different. Something that showed enslaved people as thinkers, strategists, resistors. Something her students could see themselves in. She found Marcus Whitfield's article online. She read it. She followed the citations to Nicole Harmon's book. She requested a copy through interlibrary loan. When it arrived, she read Samuel's memoir in one sitting at her kitchen table. When she finished, she sat for a long time staring at the last page. Then she had an idea. The following week, she brought photocopies of Samuel's memoir to class. She distributed them to her students. 23 teenagers, most of whom had never heard of Petersburg's role in the slave economy, most of whom assumed resistance meant running away or rebelling violently. "We're going to read this together," she said. "It's a primary source. It was written by a man who was enslaved in Virginia, about 20 miles from where we're sitting right now. And I want you to pay attention to how he resisted. Not just that he did, but how." They read it aloud, taking turns. It took 2 class periods to get through the whole thing. When they finished, Angela asked, "What did he do?" A girl named Kendra raised her hand. "He learned to read even though it was illegal." "Okay, what else?" A boy named Terrence said, "He copied the documents. He made evidence." "Why does that matter?" Terrence thought about it. Because without evidence, it's just his word against a white man's word, and his word doesn't count for anything. But documents, numbers, letters, stuff that can be checked, that's different. Angela nodded. "So what's the resistance here?" Terrence leaned forward. "He didn't just escape. He broke the system, The system worked because enslaved people weren't supposed to be able to read it, weren't supposed to understand it. He learned to read it, and then he used it against them. He made them destroy themselves, Kendra added. Angela wrote that on the board. He made them destroy themselves. She said, "This is what resistance looks like sometimes. Not violence, not escape, just knowledge, used carefully, used at the right moment." One of the students, a quiet kid named Marcus, said, "Did it work? Like, did he get free?" Angela told them the rest of the story. The settlement, the years in Richmond, William Faber's offer, the manumission, the life in Philadelphia. When she finished, Marcus said, "So he won." "Yeah," Terrence said. "He won." Angela wrote about the lesson in an article for a teaching journal called Rethinking Schools. The article was titled, "Teaching Resistance Through Primary Sources, the Samuel Bridges Case." It was published in the fall of 2017. It was read by about 3,000 teachers, most of them in urban public schools, most of them looking for exactly what Angela had been looking for: ways to teach slavery that honored the intelligence and agency of enslaved people. One of the people who read the article was a documentary filmmaker named Jada Williams. Jada was 34, based in Brooklyn, and had been making short documentaries about overlooked figures in Black history for about 6 years. She had a small but dedicated following, and she had been looking for her next subject. Something with strong archival material, something with a clear narrative arc, something that would resonate. She read Angela's article. She followed the citations. She read Nicole Harmon's book. She contacted Nicole, who was now a professor at Howard University, and asked if she'd be willing to consult on a documentary. Nicole said yes. Jada spent the next 18 months researching, interviewing historians, filming archival documents, and traveling to Virginia and Philadelphia to walk the places where Samuel had lived. She interviewed Angela Moss and some of her students, including Terrence, who was now a sophomore in college. She interviewed descendants of the Bridges family, great-great-great-grandchildren who still lived in Philadelphia, who had heard stories about Samuel but had never read his memoir until Jada showed it to them. She interviewed scholars who had studied the economics of slavery, the legal status of enslaved people, the mechanisms of resistance. And she structured the documentary around Samuel's own words, using actors to perform dramatic readings of his memoir, while archival images and expert commentary provided context. The documentary was titled The Ledger. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in April 2019. It was 58 minutes long. It won the festival's award for Best Documentary Short. A streaming service picked it up. It was released online in June 2019. In its first year, it was watched by 1.3 million people. The comment sections and social media discussions that grew up around the documentary were exactly what you'd expect from the internet. Passionate, argumentative, sometimes insightful, sometimes exhausting. Some people saw Samuel's story as proof of the power of education and individual brilliance. Some saw it as a story about the fragility of oppressive systems, how a single point of vulnerability, exploited by someone who understood it, could bring the whole structure down. Some saw it as a story about the limitations of resistance. After all, Samuel had freed himself. But slavery had continued for another 23 years. One man's liberation didn't liberate anyone else. All of those readings were true. None of them were complete. What the documentary did, more than anything, was restore Samuel's name. It pulled him out of the category of anonymous enslaved person and made him specific. A man with a mother named Patience, a skill set he had built deliberately, a decision he had made under impossible pressure, and a life he had lived afterward with dignity and purpose. In November 2020, the city of Petersburg announced that it would erect a historical marker at the site where the circuit court had once stood. The marker was funded by donations from the community, including students from Angela Moss's class, descendants of the Bridges family, and the Virginia Historical Society. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for March 2021, then delayed by the pandemic, then rescheduled for November 2021. On a cold, clear Saturday morning, about 75 people gathered on the corner of Old Street and Adams, where the courthouse had been before it was torn down in 1968. The marker was covered with a cloth. The mayor spoke briefly. Dr. Nicole Harmon, who had flown in from D.C., gave a longer speech. She said, "Samuel Bridges did something that the system he lived under was designed to make impossible. He learned, he documented, he acted, and then, and this is rarer than we often acknowledge in stories of resistance, he lived to see the consequences of that action. We honor him today not because his story is unique. There were many enslaved people who resisted in many ways, most of whose names we will never know. We honor him because his story survived. He wrote it down. His family kept it. The archive preserved it. And now it's ours to carry forward." Samuel wrote that knowledge was the only thing he possessed that couldn't be taken by force. I think he was right. But I think he left something out. It wasn't just knowledge. It was hope. Hope that someone someday would care enough to read what he had written. Hope that the truth, once documented, has a resilience that outlasts the people who tried to bury it. He was right to hope. We're here. The cloth was pulled away. The marker read, "Samuel Bridges, 1809 to 1884. Enslaved clerk who documented financial fraud by Thomas Ashford, contributing to the 1842 lawsuit Ashford vs. Ashford. His evidence led to a rare legal victory and the protection of a defrauded estate. Manumitted in Pennsylvania in 1851, Bridges lived as a free man in Philadelphia, where he worked as a bookkeeper, raised a family, and wrote an account of his life that remains a testament to intelligence, courage, and resistance under slavery. Knowledge was the only thing I possessed that could not be taken by force. I chose to use it." Samuel Bridges, 1879. After the ceremony, people stood around the marker for a while, taking photos, talking quietly. Terrence, Angela Moss's former student, stood with his hands in his pockets, reading the inscription. Angela came and stood beside him. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think he'd be glad people remember." "Yeah," Angela said. "I think so too." The folder containing Samuel's memoir still sits in the Library Company of Philadelphia, now properly labeled and cataloged. It is requested more frequently now, several times a month, sometimes more. Researchers come to see it. Students writing papers come to see it. Descendants of the Bridges family, newly aware of their ancestors' story, come to see it. The pages are fragile. The library has created a digital scan, available online, so people can read it without handling the original. But many people still ask to see the physical document. There's something about holding the actual pages, seeing the actual ink, that matters in a way a screen cannot replicate. On the final page, Samuel wrote, "I do not know if this account will be read by anyone beyond my own children. I do not know if it will matter to history, which is written by men who did not live as I lived. But I know this. I was a man who was called property. I was a man who learned what I was not supposed to learn. And I was a man who used that learning to take back, for one moment, the power that had been taken from me at birth. If you are reading this, then I was right to write it. And if you are reading this, then you know. We were not what they said we were. We were not silent. We were not simple. We were not grateful. We were watching. We were learning. We were waiting for our moment. And some of us got to see what happened when the moment came." The last sentence is underlined twice. Visitors to the archive have photographed it. Teachers have projected it on classroom screens. Filmmakers have lingered on it in slow pan. Terrence, when he first saw it during a field trip Angela organized, stood in front of the display case for a long time. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, he wanted us to know he won. And he did. Not in the way that history usually defines winning, not with armies or legislation or dramatic reversals, but in the way that matters most to people who live under systems designed to erase them. He survived. He remembered. He wrote it down. And 180 years later, we are still reading.